Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. My name is Dmitri Alperovitch. I'm chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. And I'm once again honored to welcome Sergii Grabskyi, colonel in reserve in the Ukrainian military, who has participated as part of NATO operations in Kosovo and Iraq. Sergei, first, congratulations on a stunningly successful offensive that your country has just executed in the north, recapturing, I believe, something over 3,000 square kilometers of occupied territory. So how did it happen? Was all the talk about the southern offensive in Kherson a feint, or is there actually two offensives, counteroffensives that are taking place right now?
First of all, thank you very much indeed for congratulations. Yes, it's a huge achievement of Ukrainian armed forces and Ukrainian society in general, because of, such level of unification of our society as we achieve right now, we didn't achieve it before. And regarding that offensive actions in the Kharkiv direction, we always mention three main points on the map of Ukrainian-Russian war. And there are the following. First of all, indeed, we have a very intensive battle clashes in Donbas area where Russians try to achieve the main strategic goal, declared goal actually, as I said, to liberate, in brackets indeed, territory of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, and pushing Ukrainian Nazis from the territory of Lugansk and Donetsk People Republics. Second one was the south direction, where Ukraine had and has very important goal to push back Russians from the western bank of the river Dnieper, which will have absolutely strategic consequences.
So that offensive in the south is real. That is not a feint, right?
It is not. It is not. And the third one was always our Kharkiv direction. And thinking about Kharkiv, there were two main targets for Ukrainian actions. It is not even about offensive action, but in general for Ukrainian actions there. We are talking first of all about the pushing back of Russian troops from the positions near Kharkiv, which allowed them to shell Kharkiv severely. And as you know, almost 90% of all damages were damages of civilian infrastructure and casualties of civilian people in most of the cases. And second one is about cutting off communication lines which supply and feed Russian forces operated in a zone of Izium. Why it was so important? Because of Izium group of Russian troops make some threats for Ukrainian positions in Sloviansk and Kramatorsk in general. Moreover, in a broader perspective, against the Siversk also. With that regard, those three directions for Ukrainian armed forces were critically important. And however, if we are talking about Donetsk, it was quite clear that Ukrainian forces must keep their position in order to prevent and exhaust Russian forces, prevent attacks and exhaust Russian forces trying to advance inside of the Donetsk territory. South direction. I have to say that the importance of the south direction remains remarkable. Why? Because of south direction in general meaning, in general understanding means that in case of Russian advance to the west, they would be able to cut off all supply chains and communications between mainland of Ukraine and our partners in the Black Sea, in a broader perspective in the Mediterranean Sea. Moreover, it was all of Ukrainian Black Sea ports will be captured, and Ukraine will be cut off from all sea lines there.
You're talking, of course, if the Russians had succeeded in taking Mykolaiv and Odessa, which
absolutely correct. Moreover, and Russians have declared it already, that their main goal was to get to the Transnistria, keeping in mind Moldova in general. And as I mentioned several times before, not only here in this podcast, but don't forget about 30th of December as a 100 years anniversary of the creation of the Soviet Union. I'm quite confident that deeply inside of Russian or Kremlin regime, there is an idea of declaration after 100 years restoration of the Soviet Union as a, let's say, result of Russian efforts in all of those directions. And they had actually chance to do so. If their offensive actions would be successful in Ukraine, they already have Belarus. So at least they could have three of the former Soviet republics. And advances in Ukraine, I'm talking about Moldova, will mean that Moldova will be also joined to the new restored Soviet Union. That is why south direction was, still and will, critically important. And frankly speaking, it is not clear about what was the main goal of Ukrainian armed forces in this operation. Why? Because of such kind of operation, such scale of operation, does not mean that all efforts will be concentrated in one direction. And such kind of operation always means that it will be like a main direction, additional directions, supportive directions, and destructive directions also. And it depends on the development of the situation in which direction success will be more or less remarkable and achievable. And now we see that the Russians were not ready to protect their positions in the Kharkiv regions, in Lugansk region also. And that is why Ukrainian forces hiddenly concentrated quite big amount of troops, but I have to repeat, quite big amount of troops. We can't compare strength of Ukrainian forces with the Russian forces. And that is why we can talk about maneuvers of Ukrainian forces. So it was like a flash attack which destroyed completely Russian lines, defensive lines in Kharkiv Oblast. And the quick advance of Ukrainian forces to the direction of Vovchansk, Veliki Burluk, Kupiansk and Izyum fully destroyed communication between mainland of Russia and troops operating in Izyum directions, as we call it, against Ukrainian forces in in Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. So it was like a double target operation, and at this particular moment we could say that this operation develops in a successful manner right now. And with that regard, I may say that some declarations of Ukrainian officials in latest July, beginning of August, may had like divert actions just to to force Russians to regroup troops from Donbas direction to south direction. And it is an interesting point that Russians concentrated on the western bank of the river Dnieper something between 20 up to 25,000 troops. Then Ukrainian forces cut off the lines of communications, and now those troops are in trap, actually. despite of the ability to continue defensive action on the forehead. We call it Kherson forehead.
You're talking, of course, about the cutting off, the destroying of the bridges across the river, right?
Indeed,
that prevents the supply.
Indeed, which decrease ability of sustainment and supply of Russian forces on the western bank of the river Dnieper in 75%, which not even almost fully exclude any attempts and any possibilities from Russian side to conduct any active offensive actions in the western directions. So sometimes, if I'm allowed just to turn back to the military history, it was more or less a similar example of German Nazi troops in the Second World War, when Soviet army blocked Nazis in the so-called Kurland Peninsula, where they stuck and were blocked till the end of the Second World War in Europe. And if I may, I would like to share that thought, that example in the same situation. Now we have the situation when Russian troops are blocked on the western bank of the river Dnieper, and they are not able to withdraw because of political reason and political demands of Kremlin regime. And from another side, they do not have any capabilities to withdraw. I am talking about the military options. Having that, we could say that Ukrainian forces try to solve two tasks there. Minimum task is to block Russian troops there. Maximum task to push them back and surround them. We will see, and I promise we will see how situation will develop in that direction. Kherson direction. However, now all of our attention turns to Kharkiv directions. But here, why sometimes I said I keep my very careful optimism over there, because Ukrainian forces not unlimited also. And we can't say that tomorrow we will see Ukrainian flags somewhere in Troitsky, maybe Troitsky, yes, but in the Starobelsk or in Krasnotalovka. I'm talking about the location. Krasnotalovka is a location near actually not near, on the Ukrainian-Russian border before February 24th. Ukrainian forces have to be very careful to conduct such kind of offensive actions because of, Russians, don't forget, Russians still have capabilities in somehow to concentrate and try to repulse any Ukrainian actions. But in general, I have to say that now we have an option when Ukrainian forces will try to exclude any attempts of Russians to attack the city of Kharkiv by the MLRS. We can't say that the Russians will stop using long-range missiles such as Iskander or renovated and adjusted C-300, old-fashioned rocket missiles, but still very dangerous. But it is a huge impact, and it is not only impact on the front in a military aspect, but it is also a huge impact in a political environment of Russian Federation, because I read today a lot of information coming from Russia, and I found that have a huge level of disappointment about the Moscow and Kremlin regime right now. There were a lot of complaints and demands: stop celebrating the day of Moscow, turn all money to our soldiers, I'm talking about Russian soldiers, and so on and so on. Another option, which is also simultaneously military and political option and impact, is about the level of morale of Russian forces. Demoralized forces retreating from the Kharkiv Oblast, from Lugansk Oblast, will share pandemic of demoralization to other formations of our Russian army. Yes, in time, in sometimes Russian will rebuild it because they know how to do that. But right now, we are talking about the high level of demoralization of Russian troops there.
Do you think that the Russians are capable of any counterattacks in the near future in the Kharkiv area to try to retake the lost territory?
Yes. And we have to be ready for that because of, right now, I could say it is impossible, but right now means 1 or 2 weeks maybe. But in spring, who knows? Russians will be able to counterattack. Why in spring? Because, their losses, confirmed losses, even from Russian side, means that they will need to take a lot of efforts to restore and rebuild their military capabilities. What I mean with that regard, it's about preparation of so-called specialists. The war in 21st century is not like an infantry war where lines of infantry running on the fields trying to capture defense position of opposite side. Now we are talking about the war 21st century where armament, equipment, machines actually play a huge role. But machines and other equipment will need operators. But to prepare operators such as like a tank driver and tank crew in general will need at least three months. 3 months as a minimum. And you can imagine if we will think about artillery systems, anti-aircraft system and other systems. They need to restore their capabilities, and restoration of those capabilities will strongly demand additional time at least for 3, maybe 4 months. But after that, if nothing will happen in Russia, but Russia is quite unpredictable state. If nothing will happen there, so they would be able just to try to resume offensive or, let's say, counteroffensive action to the territory of Ukraine. So that is why right now Ukrainian forces must do their best just to liberate as much territory as they could. But at the same time, as I said, despite of such an euphoria in Ukrainian offensive troops and in Ukrainian society, we have to be very careful, keep in mind quite limited capabilities to not to capture, but to keep liberated lands under control.
Were you surprised, Sergei, by the rapid collapse of the Russian forces? It seemed quite an orderly and very hasty retreat that was made, in some cases, even before the contact with the Ukrainian troops.
No, absolutely not. Because, first of all, why I'm not surprised? First of all, remember, Russian tactics and operational art based on Soviet style. And Soviet style demands a huge presence of troops in defensive lines and even a grouping of attacking troops. But if you will glance over the strengths of Russian troops operating in all Ukrainian Russian front, you will see very, very weak positions and big gaps between different units on the front line. This is the first option. And the second one, there were no second echelon, which task is to ensure stability of the front line. So, with that regard, Ukrainians use that weakness of Russian positions in that directions and quite limited number of troops in that directions. As I said before, they concentrated in the near locations a huge amount of forces, and they simply break and cut off and divide that very weak and thin defensive lines.
And that defensive lines, my understanding is, was mostly comprised of Rosgvardia, which is basically, cops with tanks and LNR conscripts who don't have high morale either or high levels of training, right? So there were not a lot of regular troops in that region. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Because of we have discussed already that Ukrainian officials declared possible counteroffensive action in the south directions, and it still looks necessary and important. But Russians immediately reacted to that and deployed their most powerful and most operatable troops. 20,000 troops must be moved from one location to another one, and they did it. And you're definitely right mentioning that the quite big number of troops located in Kharkiv Oblast, where Russian guards, volunteer battalions, and mobilized, conscripted personnel. I can't call them soldiers, unfortunately, for them. Mobilized personnel from the Lugansk and Donetsk so-called People Republics.
And why do you think, is this correct or not, but I've heard a lot of people comment that they were surprised that the Russian Air Force did not try to play a bigger role in trying to thwart this offensive. Is that truly the case, or was there more air activity? And if there wasn't, why do you think that is?
Well, if we will glance in the history of Russian Air Force, we will see, and it is true, Russian Air Force did not conduct in their history any significant operation. I mean, Air Force operation, significant means something in a scale of United States or United Kingdom Air Force operations. Moreover, the density of anti-aircraft system of Ukrainian forces significantly increased since the beginning of active phase of that war. And if you will see statistics and analyze statistics, you will find that over the last 4 months, now even 5 months, there were no even one significant airstrikes inside of the territory of Ukraine and inside of the zone where Ukrainian anti-aircraft system operates. Russian Air Force are able now just to launch rockets from the distance which exclude attack of Ukrainian anti-aircraft systems. Russian could do their bombing only in a front line, not in a deep of Ukrainian positions or Ukrainian zones of advances. And moreover, if you will see, Russian Air Force did not conduct attack in big groups. So even in Syria, where they are kings of air, they operate in pairs, not in a big squadrons or units, but in pairs. With that regard, having a huge losses in personnel and airplanes on the beginning of our war, our active phase of the war, Russians quite carefully used the air forces, and it is an additional option why they did not use it there. Critical absence of coordination between army and air force. It is a permanent and chronic weakness of Russian military machine. It happened every time. No coordination and cooperation between different branches of armed forces there.
Yeah, they're quite bad at close air support. How much equipment did they abandon in this hasty retreat, and how many POWs have the Ukrainians captured? There's a lot of pictures coming out on social media about lots of tanks and armored fighting vehicles and other equipment that seems to have been taken over by the Ukrainians. Any chance you can quantify that for us? Was it significant numbers or not?
I can't say about exact numbers, but our officials now, because of that operation is not over at the moment, that is why I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more armament, equipment, ammunition and materials captured by Ukrainian forces. But now our careful assessment allowed us to say that the Ukrainian forces captured such a big amount of equipment, armament, and materials, which may be comparable with the amount of equipment materials offered by one block of support, let's say.
So is Russia becoming one of your top providers of military equipment?
Indeed, because, if I'm not mistaken, only in case of tanks and armored vehicles, Ukrainian armed forces before that operation captured something about 300 pieces of such armament and equipment. Now, based on pictures and other information, so we would be able to create new tank companies, I guess. And many of our mechanized infantry detachment will be reinforced by the Russian equipment, and the armament, which is quite well known by Ukrainian forces. So Ukrainians now would be able just to turn the weapon against former masters of that weapon.
Did the Russians try to blow the bridges across the river as they were retreating, or did they just run so fast that they didn't even try to do that?
It depends. In some directions, they blew it up. However, not everywhere, because their main task is to retreat, simply to retreat. Leave without support people who collaborated with the Russians, and there is another aspect of that operation why they did not explode many bridges over there. But at the same time, we have to understand that now rivers and other water reservoirs become quite significant obstacle for Ukrainian forces also, because now Ukrainian forces must cross it.
So, Sergei, when we last talked, one of the things that you said that really surprised me was how Ukrainian military has not conducted a lot of training for offensive operations in the last 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, and yet this operation was executed masterfully with effective use of armor and infantry. So has the situation on the training side improved significantly for Ukrainian forces? Is the training that NATO is providing helping quite a bit in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. And, over the last few months, we had like a series of exercises and training. Actually, Ukrainian headquarters did it permanently. Despite of significant serious pressure of Russian forces in Donbas region, Ukrainian forces did a lot of trainings with incredible support of NATO through NATO advisors and United States support and United Kingdom support, which allowed them to conduct such kind of operation. However, I have to confirm my message about the lack of training, because if we will glance on the level of that operation, we will see that those operations such as Kharkiv operation and South operation is conducted by quite a small number of troops. We are talking about 3-5 brigades, which is in a traditional scale means like 2 divisions, which is very limited operational offensive action. So it's that is why I'm quite careful in my forecast about the development of the situation.
So is it fair to say that most of the Ukrainian forces are still focused in the south, in the Kherson front?
Not actually, because having such a success in the Kharkiv directions and clearly understanding that the Russians will try to recapture those lands, we have to deploy additional troops there from our reserves. And unfortunately, we can't neg our other directions, such as Chernigiv direction, Sumy direction, or even Belarus direction. So we could deploy a very limited number of troops. But as I said, this deployment will not mean that Ukrainian forces will not concentrate their efforts on the south direction. It's two different directions, and having understanding of importance of south direction also, depending on the development of offensive actions in the Kharkiv region. I would say that you remember I told about so-called minimum task and maximum task. So to block Russian troops, we will not need a huge amount of troops. To block them on the left bank of the river Dnieper.
Without compromising, of course, any operational security, what can you say about the morale and supplies and the strength of the Ukrainian forces now in that Kharkiv region? It was obviously not a cost-free operation, and we've seen some of the casualties that, unfortunately, Ukrainian forces have taken as a result of it. But how would you describe the state of the force there now?
At this particular moment, having such a success, Ukrainian society and army as armed forces as a part of the society, or now we call it defensive forces, accept those losses. Accept those losses because liberation of our territory, liberation and lives of our citizens has a price. And Ukrainian society now understands that we have to pay that price. And, this success added fuel in our engine of war to liberate our lands now. And that is why we are talking a high level of morale of Ukrainian armed forces as a part of Ukrainian society and Ukrainian society in general. And also, I would like to say that, there were some talks about their non-sufficient using of weapons provided by our Western allies. But now it is an additional point in our chat. I would like to say that these active actions and effective actions of Ukrainian forces add some confidence for supply providers. And now Ukrainian defense forces proves the ability to manage and use effectively new types of the weapon, and that is why we could say that the level of morale of our Western allies also increases.
I follow very closely the various bloggers and telegrammers on the Russian side, and they're just in absolute panic over the last 2 days. And they're talking about how the Ukrainians can move forward now and take Lysychansk back and some of the other cities in the Donbas. Do you think that's realistic at this point?
Absolutely.
The entire Russian front can collapse?
We are talking about location which previously called Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. What was the biggest mistake of Russians doing those offensive actions? They completely destroyed that lands, and they completely destroyed means they were not able to build a real defensive lines there. So it's like moonland over there, and Russians are not able to keep those positions. That is why, I wouldn't be surprised tomorrow morning to read the news that Ukrainian forces liberated. We can't use recaptured. Liberated Lysychansk at least, and possibly Severodonetsk. Possibly because of Severodonetsk located on another side of the river Siversky Donetsk.
And I just saw a note from Girkin, who I'm sure you know of, who is saying that there could even be an attack towards the Azov Sea, all the way to Mariupol, that the Russian forces in that region, near Pologi in Zaporizhia and Gulyapole in Zaporizhia, are quite weak, just like they were in Kharkiv Oblast. Do you think that's a possibility as well?
Absolutely. And I always mention that south direction, not only Kherson direction, south direction in general meaning remains critically important for us, not only to cut off any attempts of Russian advances to the west, but also to cut so-called ground corridor or land corridor from Russia to Crimea. And Melitopol, not Mariupol, but Melitopol, with that regard, play a key role in the development of the situation, because of if Ukrainian forces will capture Melitopol and then advance to the Azov Sea coast, we can say that the so-called land corridor collapsed, Russian forces divided, and those forces which will remain in so-called northern Tavria region, I'm talking about left bank part of Kherson Oblast and part of Zaporizhia Oblast, will be very weak, and they would be pressed to withdraw to Crimea, and it will be another huge impact. That is why, yes, Girkin quite clear, and he is right in most cases, talking about the weakness of Russian positions in the south directions. Because, I didn't remember, did I tell you that visualization, which we normally use, so-called wet sugar? No?
No.
In summer houses here in Ukraine, we have quite serious issue with ants, insects. Mm-hmm. So, and old school people did not use like a chemical detergents. They used sugar, wet sugar, to put piece of wet sugar in one or couple locations in the house or near the house, which attract ants to that location. So then you could simply move that wet sugar with the ants and destroy them and kill them. Mm-hmm. So the same situation, if I may, I can say the same situation we have in case of Donetsk and Donbas in general and Kherson direction, where ants or Russians concentrated their efforts in two main locations, in Donbas and Kherson directions. And they leave other locations abandoned, almost abandoned, or with the very weak positions and very limited number of troops. As we had the development of the situation in Kharkiv regions, we can't exclude the same actions and same development in the south directions also. South direction, not only Kherson, but in northern Tavria directions from Vasilievka, Pologi to Melitopol and down to Kirillivka and Berdyansk in the south direction. Because of let me guess, I can mistake, but at the beginning of summer, on the location of the Ukrainian-Russian front from Vasilievka to Veliki Novosilki, there were something about 6, maybe 7 battalion tactical groups of Russian forces, which is incredibly limited number.
Because it's a huge area, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And for your understanding, one battalion, according to the Russian manuals, may defend the section of front about 3 kilometers. So 7 battalions in general, okay, let's have like 30 kilometers only, but not 2 or maybe even 400 kilometers. You can imagine what is a concentration of Russian troops we have there. That is why I wouldn't be surprised to see that tomorrow or day after tomorrow, when Russian forces will almost use the main part of their ammunition, Ukrainians will start offensive actions in that direction. which also makes sense.
Fascinating, the wet sugar approach. Two more questions, Sergei, and I'll let you go. I know it's very late now in Kiev, so really appreciate you taking the time to explain this to our audience. But first, to go back to some of the things we saw last month in Crimea, there's a lot of speculation and amateur analysis of these strikes that occurred on Saki Air Base that destroyed a squadron of naval aviation, Russian aviation there, and a number of other strikes that impacted logistical supply lines into Kherson Oblast from Crimea. Any thoughts from you on what caused this? People are speculating that it may have been long-range missiles, it may have been kamikaze drones setting off explosives and ammunition dumps. Do you have your own theory?
My theory is we are talking about missiles.
Really?
We are talking mostly about missiles because of analysis of available video materials make me confident in the most of cases they were missiles.
And you think that this means that Western partners have provided long-range missiles to Ukraine?
Yep.
Very interesting.
Moreover, there were a couple news came maybe a few days before those operations. For instance, United States representative mentioned that they deployed some anti-radar missiles to Ukrainian armed forces. Then it was quite interesting news about that about the Ukrainian engineers were able to adjust those missiles to MiG-29 fighters.
Yeah, those are the HARM missiles to target Russian air defenses.
Correct.
Yeah.
This is my point, because you know what is a strong side of Russians, KGB or as FSB now. So they have a very well-developed network of counterintelligence actions and counter-terrorist actions. They have a huge experience coming from Chechnya and other regions. That is why I'm very doubtful about possibility and consideration regarding using of our saboteurs group or partisans operating in all of those locations. Moreover, if we are talking about Saki, results and features of strikes shows and make me confident about using of missiles.
There was another piece of news that came out a few days ago from the New York Times. I'm not sure if you saw that story, that Russia is purchasing artillery shells and rockets from North Korea. And this combined with what we now know about their raids of the Belarus ammo depots over the last 3 or 4 months. What does that tell you? Do you think this means that Russians, contrary to all the beliefs at the time of the invasion, actually does not have years worth of artillery ammo and that they may be running low? Do you think that's a possibility? You remember my statement that Russia did not make any preparation for such war as they got in Ukraine. That is why they almost exhausted their nearest warehouses. Nearest, I mean that they need just to recheck and recalibrate, if I may, those storages of ammunition. And right now we have an information. It is not new information, because in 2014 we had the same situation with both sides of the conflict. I'm talking about Ukraine and Russia. That almost 40% of ammunition did not explode. 40% was faulty.
40%,
Wow.
40% of ammunition did not explode. So that is why efficiency of Russian shelling decreases day by day. And it is an explanation why Russians looking for additional ammunition support from Belarus and I would be not surprised to see North Korea ammunition, because of North Korea actually over the last 70 years permanently do their best to be prepared for the war. So they have much higher level of readiness of their ammunition than Russians have.
Well, Sergei, it is always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Again, congratulations on your countries and your military success this week, and best of luck to you and your forces.
Thank you very much. We will continue our best to do our best to liberate our lands, and I would be happy to invite you somehow and sometimes in my lovely Crimea when it will be liberated.
Thank you.